You're listening to Messianic Insight, the live podcast from Kehilat Etz Chaim, Tree of Life Congregation in Toronto, with Messianic Rabbi Ben Volman.
I want us to open with a word of prayer. So let us approach Lekh, the words of Genesis 12 to 17, and open our hearts to God. Malkeinu, our Father and our King, be present with us as we enter into this powerful message. There is no more powerful message than a command from you. And this is one that we must take personally, and it speaks to every heart. So, Father, open our hearts to hear, to listen, and even to obey. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. Could we close some of these doors, Vlad? Thank you. Lekh. The words are simple and very powerful, and they mean go out. Leave. Get out of this place. And the command that Avram receives, beginning in Genesis chapter 12, is, in certain ways, it is the beginning of all history as we know it. Because, you see, before Avram, there is no future. There's no such thing as the future until Avram. You might say, how can that be, Ben? What do you mean there was no future? Well, there are two aspects to this. First one is what the rabbis say. The rabbis actually ask the question, how come the Bible doesn't begin with Genesis 12, verse 1? It's the most relevant thing. It's the direction that creates Israel. It's really the whole story of Genesis at the beginning. But then they say, oh, yes, well, the rest of the world kind of needed the previous chapters. And the rest of the world can see the future if there's a beginning. But in fact, Lekh is actually more powerful than that. And it does not speak to a future just because, things moved from creation to Abraham. It's because of this. Before Abraham, people did not really believe that their lives had purpose, meaning beyond life as they knew it. Their view of life was what they saw in the world, which was life, death, a circular kind of meaningless circle of somehow surviving moments of grandeur which drifted into death and decay. The circular aspect, vision of life, this is what resonates through all the great literature that precedes Abraham. All the great literature up to that moment is really about the despairing lack of a true future for any individual. Kings, empires last for a moment. Even the most distant empires knew that truth. But Avram, he receives a promise, which is beyond him. In fact, God says, I will give your people this land, up until, 1920. No, it's forever. He says, I will give you an inheritance. Look up at the stars. Can you count them? If you can count them, good for you. Then you'll have an idea of how many descendants you're going to have. And this is the beginning. Talk about a future. You will have an inheritance far beyond your belief, comprehension, understanding. You are not a single human being who has no future, no hope. I am giving you a promise. And not only that, I am not only giving you this promise. The truth is, it's not just for you. Now, if you had read this in any other book, you would be amazed at the presumption. But instead, God says, from the beginning, through you, every family on earth will be blessed. That's you. Every family on earth. Now, the power of that absolute, promise, it's greater than promise. It's blessing. It is the heart of, you can take hold of that. This is my blessing. It will last forever. And every nation will be changed by it. Every nation on earth has been changed by it. The world has been changed by it. The truth is, we live in the shadow of all those who walked in the footsteps of Abraham. And we absolutely have been lifted up into the joy, peace, and grace of the fulfillment of that promise 4,000 years ago. The truth of this word echoes through every aspect of our life. That has meaning. Because the promise and the purpose, we have seen them fulfilled. And that is the strength in which we walk. Because Abraham walked there first. That's what Lekh means, in essence. But it is more powerful than that. You see, God adds to it. And Avram, who lives between the tent and an altar, he lives in a tent. But when he meets God, he puts up altars. Reminds us that he is living between that which is temporary and that which is permanent. When he goes with God, he pitches a tent. When he meets God, he builds what? An altar. How long will the altar last? Well, he trusts it will last as long as God allows it to last. How long will the tent last? Well, until I have to move. We're the opposite. We're the opposite. We build houses to last. And as for our altars, our altars come and go. That's the difference between us and Abraham. Abraham put his whole intent into what would last. Where do we put ourselves? Where do we intentionally invest ourselves? The truth is, we most commonly invest in what is passing. Abraham invested everything into God. But you know what? The amazing thing is, and my discipleship class has heard me say this, you can't outgive God. You can't outgive God. God does more than this. He gives him the brit, the covenant. What's the covenant? The covenant is the absolute promise that he will walk with him every step of the way. He doesn't say, well, go that way. Things will work out. Remember what Moshe said? Lord, if you do not go with us, don't lead us. Right? God says, I'm not planning to let you go any step unless I am with you. I'm giving you my covenant. You know what covenant is? Covenant is the shared power of our relationship. Covenant is the shared power of prayer. Think about the shared power of prayer. Is there anything more valuable than that? How about the shared power of a community that cares? How about a shared power of a community that believes? And God says, this is righteousness. Is there any greater power than that? God gives Abraham the essence of power. He gives him himself. That's what he's giving him. That's what we give ourselves here. That's who we are. That's just the beginning. That's just the beginning. Abraham walks with God, and he's like us. He goes to the schoolhouse of life, and does he always succeed? Far from it. He really has this problem. Every time he goes to a place and he has to bring his wife with him. He must be the absolute worst traveler on earth. Every time he brings his wife with him, he gets into trouble. I have to say, he's not a person of extraordinary personal qualities all the time. But there's something about him, his persistence. He persists. He keeps going. That's the thing about Abraham. He keeps going. I think of the words of Jeremiah. I know the plans I have for you. Think about those words in Jeremiah 29. I know the plans. And this is his trust. But there's real despair because at a certain point, he gets old. Believe me, it happens. This week, I opened the mail, got something from Service Canada. It was my invitation to apply for my old age pension. I have to tell you, this was not opened with the kind of joy that I usually reserve for when I get an income tax refund. No, it was kind of like, oh my goodness, really? I'm there. Look, a lot of you have already gone there. A lot of you have already been there. It's just part of the journey. It's just part of the journey. It will happen. You're not even working at it, and it happens, right? That's the way the journey is. But he reaches this point. Sometime later, Adonai comes to him in a vision, and he says, don't be afraid. You know what? Don't be afraid of getting older. Don't be afraid because the journey seems to you to be tougher. I am your protector. Your reward will be very great. And Avram says to him, you know, Adonai, what good will your gifts be to me? I continue childless. And some guy, Eliezer from Damascus, he's going to inherit everything that I've acquired. What good is it? I seem to be coming to the end point here. I don't see this promise fulfilled. Where are you leading me anyway? You said I was going to have all these things. I don't see it. And that's part of the journey. That's how we're schooled. You come to these end points. You come to a fork in the road. And you have to say, am I going to go further? Am I going to keep on believing? Am I going to keep on trusting? Many of us know exactly what that's like. You come to a barrier. Sometimes you're not going to like what happens. You've had a job for a while, it's gone. You have an opportunity, it's cut off. The door that you thought would open closes. The expectation that things would change doesn't happen. Or, even tougher, you get what you want, and it's much tougher than you thought. And you wonder, how am I going to keep doing this? We all meet a fork in the road where we have to say, am I going to press on? And by the way, you put me here. You put me here. I've been walking with you. Where are you? And God says, wait a minute. Don't fear. I'm with you. And by the way, you have greater promises to receive than you know. Hold on. Hold on. You know what? What you think will not happen. What you fear will not overcome your life or your inheritance or your promise. I am with you. That's when he points to the sky and says, count the stars. And at that point, that is the moment. You'd think, gee whiz, wasn't the moment that Abraham believed was the moment when he stepped out and said, okay, I'll follow? The truth is, there are critical points where you have to make the decision, will I keep going? Will I keep going? This past week, I participated with my wife in something that I barely had time for, but is always extremely important to me, which is Holocaust Education Week. Because you see, tonight is Kristallnacht. It's the remembrance of the horrors in Germany, which led to the moment where finally the Germans unleashed the most terrible of their plan for the destruction of the Jewish people. And it became a public and, fully known exercise in the destruction of German Jewry, of which my family had been a part for 500 years. This past week, my wife and I attended a seminar in which a woman told her amazing story of a journey where she had committed herself to telling the story of her family. The reason she did this was not because she wanted to, because she was a teacher of the Holocaust, and for several years, she had invited Elie Wiesel, the great scholar of the Holocaust, and writer to Chicago, where she was a teacher. And Wiesel had pressed on her, do you know your family's story? Well, she had grown up surrounded with her parents and a few surviving relatives. There were only a few, as always. And to be honest with you, they didn't tell them this. They wouldn't tell us the stories. And I grew up in a house like this. You never hear the stories, really. You hear bits and pieces, and they're all fragmented. You know, and nobody sits down and says, this happened, and then that happened. And no. You hear fragments. And the fragments are not very satisfying, but even worse are the gaps. And it takes decades to fill the gaps. You know, it was not until my aunt saw my firstborn, my son, that she told me that I had a cousin who had gone with the uncle for whom I am named, that the cousin had perished in Auschwitz around the same age as the child I was holding in my arms. I mean, this is the sort of gaps. And you just hear little bits and pieces. And Wiesel said to this woman, go find out the whole story. Because if you don't, you leave your family in silence. And they will have perished in silence and exile. And they are worth more than that. I'm going back to Germany, as you know, this week to speak to people out of my faith journey. And the amazing thing is that my people were told, Lekh from Germany. In 1933, they eventually got out. And now when I go back, what am I going to say? What am I going to bring? Well, I want you to know something. First of all, I am going to bring this promise. But secondly, I'm going to bring a deeper word. Take a close look at the next section of verse 12 in chapter 15. Take a close look at that verse, because I want you to look really closely and see what happens when Avram falls asleep and God begins to cut the covenant with him, which will secure the future. As the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell on Avraham. Horror and great darkness came over him. Adonai said to Avram, know this for certain, your descendants will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs. They will be slaves and held in oppression there for 400 years. But I will also judge that nation, the one that makes them slaves, afterwards. They will leave with many possessions. As for you, you will join your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. And only in the 4th generation will your descendants come back here, because only then will the Emori and the punishment will be ripe for punishment. And then after the sun had set and there was thick darkness, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appeared, which passed between the animal parts which Abraham had laid out earlier. These were animals which he had laid out as signs of covenant. And that day Adonai made a covenant with Avram. I have given this land to your descendants. Now, this is an amazing thing. But I want you to see something here. Horror. Avram enters the horror of Egypt. God could not speak to him about the horrors of one generation after another. But for a moment, he enters the horror of Egypt. I want you to realize that each of us in our faith journey, when we come to grips with the covenant that God himself ratifies for us, because God ratifies the covenant, not Avram. We are weak. We will falter. If we say, I promise I will do it, maybe we'll do it. But if God promises to do it, it will happen. Right? God ratifies the covenant. But it is a passage through terror, through horror. It is a passage through a difficult way that no one can understand. And we think of those who pass through these, well, they pass through horrors which we cannot even possibly comprehend, but to which we now speak because, and this is the greatest thing, because he is the God who raises the dead. He is the God, Mechai Hemetim. He's the God who, first of all, raises up Avram's own son Isaac when he is bound and he is called to sacrifice him. God raises him up. That's the first resurrection. And at the ford of the river Jabbok, when Jacob goes there and he thinks he's going to have his own way and meets the angel, what happens? He walks away limping because the angel pulls out his thigh muscle. But you know what? He's wounded and he has a new name. He's a different man. Mechaye Hametim. The old Jacob has died. Israel is alive. And when Yeshua dies and rises on the third day, according to the word of the prophets, who is the first prophet? It's Abraham. Abraham is the first prophet. The whole story is one of Mechai Hametim. Because we go through horror. There is a sacrifice in us which must be made, which is to let go of the old life. Out of which God says, Lekh Lekh, go out of here. I have something new for you. And you must follow it. But we pass through horror. The woman who shared this past week uncovered one of the most painful possible stories of her family, which had been long buried. It was an uncle whose memory had long been, it seemed, suppressed and lost. And this is why it was lost, because the uncle had died at about 12 years old, and the circumstances were more than heartbreaking. Here's what happened. He had survived almost to the end of the war. He was actually working as a shepherd, but he had family in the camp at Auschwitz, and he brought himself near to Auschwitz because he knew he had a sister there. And at one point, he actually saw his sister on the other side of the barbed wire. And he walked virtually right up to the wire, and he was caught, pulled inside, and the Nazis sentenced him to immediate death. The young man named David screamed at them even at the last minute and said, Our brothers will come from the Soviet Union. They'll bring revenge on you. And even as they were firing at him, he pulled off his shoe and threw it at them because he believed. He believed in something greater. And the woman shared this story. I think she had told it so many times, she had run out of tears. But as I thought of this story, I thought of my own family. Mechaye hametim. He raises the dead to speak through us. Abraham is not here, but he speaks through us. And we do not have the brit with God, but we have the fellowship and we have that sense of his nearness. And it comes because we are surrounded by a company of prayer and love and faith and hope, which we share together. And though we pass through horrors, and remember, there is a greater future for us. Because God has given us a promise. Abraham did not see any of it. But in a sense, he passed through it. And when I go back to that place from which my people were expelled in silence and into exile, you know what I bring? I bring you. I bring you, my friends who share with me in this hope. Those of you who share with me in this message, in the life which we have, which is beyond the greatest promise that we could have ever had, that there is life beyond life. Mechaye hametim. Imagine the beauty of such a hope and that we have to share. My friends, you are on your journey and you have passed through such difficult, challenging moments. When I speak with you, for you. And I share because of what we share. We are weak, but God is strong. And he will confirm every aspect of the promise which he made to Israel. My grandfather went to Israel when Tel Aviv was just being birthed as a city. Today, his family fills the nation. His relatives are throughout the country, and my own brother has returned and flourishes, surrounded by family. Lekh Lecha can seem an empty word, but the promise that it gives, that is the promise of life. Let us believe together. Wherever God is sending you, walk with him faithfully. When you reach the fork in the road, press on. I think of these words of Rav Shaul. You know, one of my professors, a beloved teacher, he really thought this was the last letter. And he pointed to these words and reminded us, look at verse 10. Yes, I gave it all up in order to know him. That is, to know the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, as I am being conformed to his death, so that somehow I might arrive at being resurrected from the dead. It is not that I have already obtained it or already reached the goal. No, I keep pursuing it in the hope of taking hold of that for which Messiah Yeshua took hold of me. Brothers, I, for my part, do not think of myself as having yet gotten hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining forward, pressing on toward what lies ahead. I keep pursuing the goal in order to win the prize of God's upward calling in Messiah Yeshua. Therefore, as many of us are mature, let us keep paying attention to this. Press on. Keep going. And pray for me. Pray that God will open a door into silent places, lost memories, broken hopes. I will go to cemeteries, but those places are places of people who are not forgotten. We'll go to homes where there are brass plaques in the street because we remember. And trust with me. Mehaye Hamatim. God will raise up that which is his purpose for me and for you. Let us pray. Vinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King. So much has been given to us. We live in a land of blessing. We live in a place of hope. We have been standing on the shoulders of giants. People of faith who pressed on despite everything. Abraham had no teacher, but we have many teachers. Abraham was never going to see the fulfillment, but God counted to him as righteousness, a faith that modeled for us what righteousness means, even though we are just sinners saved by grace. So, Father, teach us again. Lead us as you led Abraham. And, Father, give us one last gift. Give us the gift of laughter. Because when he heard he was going to actually have that son, he laughed. And so did Sarah. Help us to have the joy, the ultimate promise, not only all this, but the joy too of the Lord. That we may walk and love one another, caring, fulfilling with an ease and with grace, in such a way that others will be drawn by love, by joy, and by those who have a heart for God, because we know how to love each other. And so fulfill the ultimate command of Yeshua. Love one another. For it's in Yeshua's name, in his fulfilling grace, we speak all of these words. Mechai Metim. Amen. Amen.